Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. The Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. Long live the King. You may be seated. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Morning, sir.
Morning.
Who's that?
Justice Hennessy, today we have Professor Eric Kirzner on the stand, and with the court's permission, I would ask that we split this examination as well and let my colleague, Ms. Sang, conduct the credentials aspect of the examination. My friends have agreed.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Before we begin today, I would like to enter a series of documents as numbered exhibits. These have already been provided to the court and to our friends in both physical copy and digitally. The first document is the expert qualification of Professor Eric Kirzner, an agreement as to admissibility of his report. I believe this will be exhibit number 36.
Thank you.
You will see that Professor Kirzner
Court's
is,
indulgence, exhibit 37.
oh, sorry, 37. You will see that Professor Kirzner is an economist, qualified as an expert in investment issues, including investment sustainability, rates of return and bring forward calculations, asset and risk allocation, portfolio management, investment product knowledge, pension and endowment fund management, the calculation of investment losses, and investor decision-making.
And you're going to remind me, as hasn't happened so far in this trial, you're going to remind me, you intend to go through the qualifications with them?
Yes, that's correct.
Just to remind me at the end that you're going to ask me to qualify the witness as per the consent.
Yes.
Thank you.
The second document we would like to enter as exhibit number 38 is the expert report of Professor Eric Kirzner and Professor Lawrence Booth on the present value of historic losses in the matter of Bristol et al. In Canada et al. And White Sanded Red Rock in Canada et al. Dated July 14th, 2022, updated November 25th, 2022, and redacted December 14th, 2022.
Thank you. Just going to compare that to what I've been working with. Okay, very good. Thank you. 37, right?
That'll be 38. That will be 37.
You might check, Madam Registrar, later to make sure what everybody else has was 36. Thank you. Thank you.
And the third document we would like to enter as exhibit number 39 is the Sir Reply Report of Professor Eric Kirzner and Professor Lawrence Booth dated December 5th, 2022, redacted December 14th, 2022.
Thank you.
Professor Kirzner, I understand that you have co-authored the reports we mentioned just now. Can you confirm they form the contents of your opinion?
Oh,
Court's
I
indulgence.
think we have to affirm or swear the witness.
Can we swear the witness?
Pardon. Professor Kirzner, Would you state and spell your first and last name for the record, please?
Certainly. So it's Eric, ERICKIRZNER.
Do you solemnly, sorry, I should ask, is it your preference to affirm? the
I
following?
will affirm if you don't mind. Thank you.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to the court touching the matters in question between the parties shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I so affirm.
Thank you.
And going back to the question we just left off with, can you confirm that the co-authored reports that you have up there form the contents of your opinion?
Yes, I so confirm. Yes.
Thank you. Can you also confirm that you signed a document to abide by Rule 4.1 of the Ontario Rules of Civil Procedure, and that you understand that it is your duty to best assist this court?
Yes.
Professor Kirzner, I have a few questions to highlight your experience for the court today. Why don't we start off with your education? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I have a BA in political science and an MBA, and a number of courses in the doctoral program. That's my educational background.
And did you specialize in anything during your MBA?
Finance.
I see that you are currently the John H. Watson Chair in Value Investing, Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. Could you tell us about your responsibilities and what value investing is?
So an endowed chair is sort of the second highest position at a university. There's associate professor, then endowed chair, and finally professor of the university. I have an endowed chair. I was fortunate enough to receive it in 2003 because of my background in investment finance and corporate finance. The chair is in value investing, which is the area that was made famous by Benjamin Graham and then Warren Buffett and then Sir John Templeton. I wrote a book with Sir John Templeton, and I received the endowed chair. As a result, I built up a program in value investing. I went to Columbia to interview Bruce Greenwald, who was sort of the guru of value investing, and built up a program which included a trip with my students every year to visit Warren Buffett. We had a good time with that. And I retired in 2018 from teaching, but the university was kind enough to allow me to keep the endowed chair title and the professor emeritus title.
And if you don't mind, do you mind describing what exactly value investing is?
So value investing is the approach of valuing companies on the basis of assets and expected earnings, and the search to find essentially bargains, trying to find a dollar of value to be able to buy it for 50 cents is the way it's often described. It's the fundamental analysis approach, and it's a very rigorous approach to evaluating companies.
Okay, thank you. And I see you've also been on a number of investment and pension plan committees. Can you tell us about the work you did as the lead advisor to the Hospital of the Ontario Pension Plan?
So I was asked to join HOOP, Hospital of Ontario Pension Plan, at some point, I forget exactly when, as an advisor. And after a few years, I was appointed as the lead advisor. My role was to essentially advise the trustees on the decisions that had to be made with respect to the structure of the portfolio, the assets that were invested in, and establishing and estimating rates of returns that the fund was likely to develop in order to meet the pension promise. It was about a $30 or $40 billion pension plan at the time I joined. I think it's now about 140 or 50 billion, one of the more successful pension plans. And our responsibility was essentially to the pension beneficiaries.
Thank you. I see that you've also done work with IROC. Tell us about that, and can you please tell us what IROC stands for?
So I was appointed to the Board of Regulation Services around 2002. It was the board that regulated markets in Canada. And eventually, Regulation Services merged with the Investment Dealers Association to form IROC. I was on the merger committee that created IROC, the Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. And IROC regulates both markets and members in Canada. So it's a self-regulatory organization recognized by the Ontario Securities Commission, actually by all securities commissions, as the regulator of markets and members.
Thank you. And I see you've also done work on something called the FPX indexes. What is that?
So in 1997, I was approached by the Financial Post with my partner at that time, Richard Croft, and they wanted to develop their own set of market indexes. They wanted to compete with Standard & Poor's. And I said, I can't do that. I'm not going to compete with Standard & Poor's, but I have an idea, and that is to develop a set of passive indexes that investors can use to measure the performance of their portfolio and to judge whether they're getting good investment advice. So these indexes, there's a safety, there's a growth, and there's a moderate version of the index. They've been published ever since we developed them in 97. One of the insurance companies has adopted it as a program for some of its investors, and it was based on using a really evaluation of historic rates of returns and optimize what's called an optimizer in order to determine what is the best mix of securities for investors in certain classes. So that's the FPX indexes.
Thank you. Are they still used today? Are the indexes still used today?
They're still being quoted today. Absolutely, yes.
And this is my last question, but can you tell me how these experiences are relevant to the work you did on the Bring Forward analysis?
Well, as my background shows, I have spent a good deal of my career calculating rates of returns, estimating rates of returns, telling investors how to measure the performance of their portfolios, and evaluating investments, building portfolios. I think all of those which are relevant to the matter at hand.
Thank you. Justice Hennessy, those are all of my questions, and I will now turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Evans.
Thank you.
We would also like to have Professor Kirzner qualified as an expert as we've set out in his qualifications.
Thank you. I will qualify on consent. I take it, counsel.
Yes.
I will qualify Professor Kirzner to give opinions in the area in which he has been qualified as per Exhibit 37. Thank you.
Thank you.
My friend did not deal with the errata. Is Evans going to be dealing with that? Okay, I have a concern about the errata. I don't know if I should deal with it now, and maybe I can just telegraph to my friend my concern. Some of the errata is electronic spreadsheets, and the spreadsheets were provided to us electronically this morning, and of course, those spreadsheets form the basis on which the numbers are derived. And it would be helpful if my friend could indicate, perhaps in another email, where the changes were made on spreadsheets 3 and 6, so that we can ascertain what the changes were.
Is this something you want some time to talk about before
Uh,
the beginning of the,
Well, I guess
Examination.
I don't want to object if I can get the data, but I will object to new information coming in so late in the day after a case is over. That changes either the methodology or the figures. I don't think it's fair to us, especially if we don't know what it is. And
right, which is why I asked, do you want some time before the examination begins to see if you can determine that?
I'm happy with that. It'll only take a couple of minutes.
All right, why don't we do that?
Okay.
Just take some time, see if you can satisfy what your questions are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take 5. Is that-
Thank
Yeah,
need
five-
longer?
five-
Okay.
Maybe we could send us-
This court will recess for 5 minutes.
Are you able to just send us, something that we highlighted?
Thank you for that indulgence, Justice Hennessy. I've now agreed with my friends that we will be providing them with an additional electronic copy of the revised spreadsheets with the specific changes highlighted.
And that'll help.
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
The first thing I'd like to do then, Professor Hennessy, is Mark has an exhibit, the next, this slide presentation of Professor Kirzner, and that's already been handed out to my friends in the court. And have we agreed that it can be marked as the next numbered exhibit?
As long as my friend can advise that either the witness will testify to the matters in the slide deck or it's already in his report, I have no problem marking it.
Very good.
Thank you, Mr. Schechter, and I can advise that that's the case. In many instances, most instances, the specific paragraph numbers from the report are indicated on the slide deck.
Very good.
So I'm going to provide a copy of this to Professor Kirzner.
Okay. Thank you.
And that will become exhibit 40.
Yes, this will now be Exhibit 40. Professor Kirzner, did you prepare this slide deck?
Yes, I did.
I understand that there are a couple of errata that we need to go through first, both to your reports and your slide deck. So I'd like to start with a list of errata that I've already shared with my friends, and the
Okay,
court
it's
should have a
just-
copy as well.
Just coming up. Thank you.
Professor Kirzner, I'll give you a copy as well. We can mark this as the next exhibit, Exhibit 41.
Thank you.
Now, I understand, Professor Kirzner, that as you were preparing for your testimony, you realized that there had been an error in some of your spreadsheets with respect to 8 years. Can you explain what you discovered and why you've made these corrections?
Exactly. There were 8 years, not in models 1 and 2 were unaffected. In models 3 and 4, where I had constrained inflation at a minimum of 1%, I discovered there were 8 years in which inflation was set not negative, but set at 0. Instead of 1.01, it was set at 1.0. So I corrected those. It was 8 years. I remember one of them was 1925, 1953,
They're listed in your slides.
I've
We'll go through
supplied that.
Different years.
Yeah, different years. There were 8 of them. And so I corrected spreadsheet 3, which dealt with models 3 and 4 to correct that. And then that meant that the rates of returns for those 8 years were affected for the multipliers in spreadsheet 6, my final results. So that's the correction.
And ultimately, the change from in those 8 years from a 0 inflation to 1% inflation resulted in slightly higher figures for your Model 3 and Model 4.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Thank you. And so this errata here indicates the higher figures.
Yes, let me just make sure.
Yeah.
Should be. Yeah, 6.824, I remember that's, and 6.655.
Thank
Yes.
you. And then this also had a an impact on your average compound annual growth rates. On page 2 of the errata,
Yes,
referring to page 46 of your report, I see that the compound annual growth rates under Model 3 and Model 4 have also been adjusted slightly upwards.
yes, for Model 4, for example, it went from 4.64 to 4.66.
Thank you. Now, we have provided this errata as well as revised copies of the spreadsheets. And I've committed to my friend that we will, undertaken to my friend that we will highlight those specific eight years. Let's then look at your slide deck. There are a couple of changes required to it as well. And the first one is on slide 2. Can we turn up slide 2, please? Now, here I see we have an asterisk beside the numbers for Model 3 and Model 4. And the asterisk indicates what you already told us, Professor Kirzner, that the figures for Models 3 and 4 have been adjusted because the previous figures in your opening report used a 0 inflation rate for the years, and then there's those 8 years listed. And the new values now apply the 1% rate. So that is reflected in that slide 2, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, the heading there says that some of these numbers, the top row is the Booth-Kirzner numbers, and these came from your report and relied on the original figures for net Crown resource revenues provided by David Hutchings in July 2022. Is that right?
That's correct. They're based on the July numbers.
The July numbers.
Yeah.
So the correction that's required to slide 2 is where it says based on D Hutchings October 2022 numbers, that should read July. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. Because Mr. Hutchings did provide October numbers, but you're not dealing with those October numbers in these spreadsheets.
No,
in these,
I
slides.
worked with the July numbers.
July numbers.
Yes.
Okay, and I'll move on to the next correction then. So on the next page over, slide 3, and we'll go back over these slides so you can explain them, but right now we're just going to deal with the corrections that need to be made.
Sorry, I will just.
We're going to go back over these slides so you can explain the content, but right now we're just going through the
understand. That's
corrections.
fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
so there's also a correction required on slide 3.
I did not mark my slide 2 correction. If you would point it out.
It's
please.
where it says in the title, based on D Hutchings October 2022,
It's only.
that should be
says
July
Thank
2022. And that's the Booth-Kirzner is based on the July 2022 numbers. The other 3 numbers, the Bond, BTAR, and Stiglitz-Hutchings, come straight from Hutchings February 2023 estimates. And Professor Kirzner will explain that as we go through the slide. So the next change that's required on slide 3 is again to change the word October to July. Is that right, Professor Kirzner?
That's correct, yes.
And then that also means the July data had the nominal NCRRs as 1.1 billion rather than 1.063. So that 1.063 needs to be changed to 1.1 billion. Is that right?
This mine says 1.043.
It says 1.063 in the first bullet point.
Oh, the first.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The July data had a total of 1.1 billion.
Yeah, I recall the 1.1.
Yeah, we can show you in your report,
Yeah, no,
actually.
I recall the 1.1.
Would you like to take a look at, it might be helpful actually to take a look at Exhibit 38, your original report. Appendix A is your instruction letter. And the last page, that appendix, is a chart showing the figures that were taken directly from Mr. Hutchings' report.
Right, that's the, there's that 1.
And you
yes.
can see that 1.1 in
Yeah,
the top
there's
left.
the 1.1. Yes.
So Are you
So this
following,
is
Justice
page,
Hennessy?
this is page 56 of. the report?
55.
Ah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, 56 is the Hurons, 55 is the Superior.
thank you. 1.1, got it.
Yes. So in July, Mr. Hutchings came up with the total nominal NCRRs of 1.1 billion. Is that right?
That's right.
Then he came up with new numbers in October where they went down to 1.063.
Mhm.
Then he came up with new numbers in February when he was testifying, and they came down to 1.04, 043. But Professor Kirzner, you are always using the original set of numbers from July of 2022. Is that right?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
So on average, then your numbers are likely to be higher than they would have if you were using Mr. Hutchings' lower NCRRs.
I can only answer the first part. My revised numbers are slightly higher than, well, I shouldn't say slightly, they're higher than the original numbers. I can't tell you what the result is of juxtaposing that with the 1.1 to 1.046.
Thank you.
It's the balancing act.
Right.
I haven't done that calculation.
Thank you. So I just to finish up the corrections. So we've on the corrections on slide 3, October should be July and 1.063 should be 1.1. And then the final change to your spreadsheet, your slide deck is slide 75. Let me turn to slide 75. Okay. And here there are 2 corrections required to this sheet. One is to change October to July in the heading. Is that right, Professor Kirzner?
Right? Yes.
And the second is just an error in transcription. I see that model 3 in the electronic version, we see the correct number. Model 3 is 6,655,000,000. But in the printed copy, there's an error. It says 6,539,000,000. So we need to correct that model 3 on slide 75. It should be 6,655. Is that right?
And mine has been corrected?
I don't believe it's being corrected by hand, I
Thank you.
believe. Yes.
Should be the same as slide 2.
It should, thank you very much, Professor Kirzner. It should be the same as slide 2. It's some sort of glitch in the copying of the chart, as I understand it. So with those corrections dealt with, and I think I'd like to just have you start, Professor Kirzner, by going through your slide deck for us.
Fine. Okay. Thank you.
Do you want to start for us on slide 2 and explain the chart that you have there?
Okay, so various experts for the plaintiffs and the defendants came up with different values.
Sir, as you begin your
Yes.
examination, certainly it'll help me, different values for what? So just sort of
Oh,
finish
sorry,
your.
different
based on
present values based on the NCRRs.
Got it, thank you.
And they came up with different values, as you can see. Some based their model on the long-term bond rate, some base it on the band trust account rate, some base it on a 60-40. As I know it's been, you know, that a 60-40 portfolio. We used a different model, and what I'd like to do this morning is explain why the experts came up with different values, that what led to the experts coming up with different present values, or bring forward values, as it's sometimes called in this matter.
And what are you going to use? Present value or bring forward?
So that's the present value of the NCRRs.
And you're going to call it present value all the time?
I'm going to call it either present. I might occasionally say bring forward value. I'll try to stick with,
Okay.
Your Honor, I'll try to stick with one term if I can. I'll try to use present value. I might occasionally slip into bring forward value. They mean the same thing. At least they
Thank
do to me.
Thank you.
I think we're on slide 3 then.
Got it.
So again, so my objective is to, well, first of all, we made this correction to this slide. And we know that the experts all use the same starting date and the same ending date. They all used 1850, the starting date, and they used 2019 as the ending date. And again, I want to explain why, even though we had the same starting and ending dates, why we had different results. And we can go on to the next slide. So the different results are going to reflect the different assumptions that the experts used. That some experts used the trust accounts and some did not. Some used certain types of models and others used different models. And some used, well, they all use different proxies for the rates of returns. So the different results in terms of the present value numbers reflect the different assumptions and the different proxies or rates of returns that are used.
Thank you. Now I see your next slide is really just an agenda to keep track of where we're going.
So
And-
I'll go through this real. We've already talked about my bio. What I'm going to do is provide an overview of our compensation model to calculate the present value of the RST net crown resource revenues. I'm going to first provide a sort of a generic explanation of what we did. Then I'm going to talk about annual rates of returns and how they're calculated. And then I'm going to talk, Your Honor, about multipliers and why everything is based on the multipliers that various experts used. Everybody had a multiplier. They just happen to be different.
Mhm.
I'm then going to describe our present value, i.e. bring forward model. I'm going to talk about how we sampled from the band trust accounts in order to explore the spending patterns of the bands. We went into the trust accounts to examine the spending patterns of the bands. And then I'm going to explain how we use that. I'm going to talk about how we categorize the various spending that was done by the bands over the period. And then I'm going to explain how we calculated the annual rates of returns based on the spending patterns of the bands and assumptions about social investment. And then finally, I'm going to talk about our results. And I'm going to try to reconcile why the experts came up with different results. So that's the
Thank you.
That's the intention. So
So-
we can go on to the slide after this. I'm going to provide the overview of our compensation model,
Did-
calculate present value.
Now,
Yes,
we've jumped ahead here
sorry.
to slide 16. Did we want to do that? I think we should can we go back to the next slide, which was slide 7, I believe. Now, I know that the first thing you dealt with in your agenda is your mandate and your bio, but I think it would be helpful to just scan
I
through
see.
these
Yes,
slides to make sure
yes.
that there's nothing new in here or
This was
you may
the
want to
instruction.
expand.
There's some highlights from the instruction letter we received from Department of Justice in July. And we were asked to develop an appropriate methodology to determine present values, bring forward values incurred by the Crown's breach to the RSC, the Robinson's Superior Treaty First Nations, with respect to the shortfall of the annuity payments. And then to apply the methodology to a set of net Crown resource revenues as estimated by both the plaintiff's experts and the defendant's experts. Your Honor, we were not involved in the calculation of the net Crown resource revenues. Other experts were, but we were given a set of net Crown resource revenues to work from. We were not involved in the calculation of those NCRRs.
Thank you, Professor.
Nor is that our area of expertise.
Thank you, Professor Kirzner. So here you note that you were asked to apply the methodology to sets of NCRRs as estimated by both the plaintiff's experts and defendant's experts. So the plaintiff's experts, of course, were Mr. Hutchings. Is that
That's
correct?
right.
And did you conduct any analysis of defendant's experts numbers?
I don't believe we were ever given defendant NCRRs.
Thank
There
you.
was an expectation we might, but we didn't. So
Can we move to slide 8 then? I think you've already made this point.
Well, I always want to indicate that we accept our role, that we know our role is to provide to help Her Honor to the extent that we can, provide advice to Her Honor if she finds it useful. And that we also, and I will be doing this at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to draw attention to a couple of items that could have led to different conclusions. Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of caveats to the approach we've used, which I think is important.
Thank you. So slide 9, you can explain for us, it'd be helpful to know what you're testifying on versus what Professor Booth will be testifying to.
So Professor Booth is going to talk about the conceptual background to approach, and he's going to do something called benchmarking, which he'll explain. He's going to discuss our economic interpretation of calculating present values. He's going to discuss in detail how we came up with the rates of returns on the various social investments. He's also going to discuss in detail why we used depreciation on those rates of returns. And he's also going to explain how we came up with the depreciation numbers. I'll touch on that lightly, but he's going to go into greater detail on how those depreciation numbers were calculated and why we used them. And he will also provide a critique of the Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins' reply. I'm going to.
You're just a
Yeah,
bit
I'm
fast for me, so
I'm
it's a
sorry.
long answer. I can usually,
Apologize, Your Honor, I will slow down.
okay, very good. Thank you.
I'm going to provide an analysis of the trust accounts, of how we use the trust accounts and how we sampled from those trust accounts. I'm going to explain how we implemented our model, first generally and then in greater detail later on. And then I'm going to conclude with the present value of the experts' calculations of the NCRRs and provide a comparison among the experts and an analysis of why the results differed.
Thank you. So moving on to the next slide, slide 10, I see here now we summarize your credentials, and I think we have gone over those with my colleague, Ms. Sang. Is there anything else you wanted to add from either this slide 10 or slide 11, the next one?
If you could just advance, and I'll see if there's anything else that I think should be highlighted. As you can see, I've sat on I have, considerable pension plan and endowment fund experience, and, I was a member of the University of Toronto Asset Management Pension and Endowment Fund, the Canada Council of the Arts, which was essentially an endowment fund giving out gifts, prizes to needy and worthy people in the arts. I have a fair amount of regulatory experience, some of which I described earlier, IROC, and I was also appointed the public governor of the Toronto Futures Exchange by the Ontario government in the 1990s. The next page, we've talked about that, the areas of.
Yes, and I think on 13 as well. You did mention 13 investment books, and I know you mentioned you authored a book with Sir Templeton.
So those were all either single authored or co-authored books by, respectable publishers such as Penguin and Viking and McGraw-Hill. And those books all dealt with investing principles, building portfolios, valuing companies, calculating rates of returns. I also had a byline in the Financial Post for a number of years, and I had one article that actually drew the attention of the university, and they put me in their book of scholars for this. I wrote an article in September 12th, 2001 on a speculative piece on whether the possibility that the terrorists had sold short the market in advance of September 11th, 2001. It was was a speculative piece, but it ended up in the US Homeland Security Act as a footnote. And
Interesting.
that was it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. So then slide 14 then is yet a reminder of where we are in the agenda. And I think then we can
Right.
move over to slide 16, where you provide an overview of your compensation model.
So our methodology, Your Honor, is a refinement of models that we've developed previously. We've made some changes and some refinements to the model in this matter. Facts are somewhat different and different application. But the real issue for us is what should have been done, what would have been done, and what should have been done. And those are different words, and I realize that. Been done with the increased annuity payments that should have gone to the RST treaty beneficiaries. If they had received those increased or enhanced annuity payments, how would they have spent it? How would they have invested it? How would they have actually found a mix between spending and investing?
Professor Kirzner, I just noticed in your first bullet point, you say it's a refinement of models you developed and applied in previous special claims tribunal and federal. Do you intend federal court trials there? It says federal case, but I think
Sorry,
it says federal case trials in your bullet point. I think that should be federal court trials. Is that right?
that would be federal court, yes.
Right.
Federal-
So you've
yeah.
testified previously on present value analyses in the special claims tribunal and in federal court?
Yes, we have. Yes, we have.
Thanks. All right, shall we move on then? Slide 17.
So the crux of our model is the use of the spending patterns of the bands and our analysis of the band trust accounts. We think they're important. We think that an understanding of how the bands actually spent their money in the relevant period provides and informs how they would have spent, should have spent the money had they have received the enhanced amounts. So we use the band trust accounts directly. I think other experts may have referred to them, but they wouldn't have used them directly.
So then slide 18.
I think okay. So we believe that any bring forward or future value compensation, and it should be grounded in the spending patterns of the bands. We don't believe that a simple compounding exercise, such as the use of a government bond rate or a band trust account rate, captures what might have happened. So we actually use the historic spending pattern data from the band trust accounts to inform how the additional payments would have been spent. And in a little later, probably this morning or early this afternoon, I'm going to explain how we use those trust account data. So here's our model.
Now we're on slide
just-
19.
Just give me one moment.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So we're on slide 19 now.
So this is a very important slide. So we're going to provide estimates of annual rates of returns from 1850 to 2019. All of the experts, the plaintiff experts and the defendant experts have annual rates of returns as the base to their model. Ours are based on the actual spending patterns of the bands. Other experts are based on different ways of calculating rates of returns.
They're all different. Well, essentially, they're all the same. They just use different rates.
That's exactly right. The methodology, in my opinion, is the same. It's the fact that we all use different rates of returns.
Actually, sorry, I thought when you said the other experts have different models, their models essentially provide a different rate But you say your model is a different, you're looking at something different. Or do I have that right?
Your Honor, I don't think that the experts had different models precisely.
Okay,
I believe that the experts had essentially different ingredients, or metrics to the models that the distinguishing feature among the experts is how they calculated the annual rates of returns. Because, Your Honor, the annual rates of returns then translate into the multipliers to be used each year. And that ultimately is used to calculate the present value of the NCRRs. So in my view, that's the distinguishing features among the experts is the rates of returns.
okay, right. So but they do the same thing with different rates of return.
I think if you looked at the, well, and you certainly have, I know, because they've testified and you've seen it. So the plaintiffs indeed came up with annual rates of returns, which they then applied to the NCRRs. They multiplied the rate of return by the NCRR. They came up with an present value for each year. They added up all of those present values to come up with the numbers that are contrasted in slide 2 of my presentation.
Professor Kirzner, I think
Yeah.
this might help. We've heard before in testimony that the average used by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings for the 60-40 portfolio, the average was 7.2%, but that's only an average, am I right?
That would be the average that we would call it the geometric mean, but it's the average. That's correct.
But in each separate year, those experts would have applied a different rate, just like you did. Is that
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
And similarly, when we talk about the average or mean of the band trust account rate being 5.3%,
No, but I think that's very important. Your Honor, 7.2 was the average and ours was
4.66,
I
model 4 was
want to make
4.66.
sure I've got the right number here. It's 6 point, no,
It would be
4.6, I think.
4.66.
Yeah. Okay, so ours was 4.6 and theirs was 7.2. And in a few minutes, I'm going to provide some illustrations of how even a small difference in rate of return, let alone a large one, creates a very large difference in the multiplier.
And on that point, all experts agree.
I would think so.
So we're back to slide 19, I think is where I interrupted you.
So those annual rates of returns translate into multipliers for that year. And then if you take the multiplier for the year times the NCRR for the year, you get the bring forward number for the year. And then if you take a sum of all of those bring forward numbers, you get the present value of the NCRRs. And all of the experts would have done that.
Thank you. And here we're on slide 20.
So if the money had been paid to the bands, if the enhanced annuity payment had been paid to the bands, where might it have gone? Where would it have gone? Well, some of it would have been spent. Some of it would have been consumed, which in our model earns the rate of inflation, which I'll explain. Professor Booth will elaborate on that in greater detail, but I will provide at least some explanation of that. Some would have gone to what we call social investment. The bands would have invested in infrastructure, in business, in health, education. Other such,
You call all of those social,
we call all of those social investments. for the benefit of the
infrastructure,
band.
infrastructure, business, health, education. Okay,
We actually lump health, education, medical into human. We'll call it human.
Okay.
And we'll,
Human capital, I think is how you referred to it in your report, human capital.
Human capital,
Yeah.
yes.
So you've got under social investment, you've got infrastructure, business and human capital.
Yes,
And the human is then the, as you said,
but those all comprise what we call social investment for the band, for the benefit of the band. Some of it would have been transferred to individuals, individual band members.
And
What
that's
would-
not social investment.
No, so,
That's
okay,
distributed.
so. An extra dollar of annuity.
Mhm.
Some of it would have been consumed.
Okay.
Some of it would have been invested in social investment
Yes,
by the band, the collective,
thank you.
and some of it would have been paid out to individuals. And what would the individuals have done? Some of it would have been invested in social investment as well for the benefit of the band. And some would have been consumed. So here I'm talking about an individual band member who receives a transfer from the band, the collective, and they too would have invested some in social investment and some would have been consumed.
And the first consumed, that was also by the band? You say if they'd been paid an extra dollar, where might it have gone? Some spent, some consumed, some social investment. Some paid out to individuals, of which some would be consumed, some invested in social investment.
And Your Honor, some of it would have stayed in the band's trust account.
Okay, but that first consumed, that's consumed by the band?
Right, you are. First is consumed by the band as compared by the second part, which is consumed by the individual.
Right.
Your Honor, again, I just want to emphasize that some of it would have been spent, but some of it would have stayed in the band's trust account. And it would have earned the band trust account rate.
thank you, Professor Kirzner. Can we move to slide 21?
So this again is present value of the NCRRs. These are model 1 and the corrected number for model 4 at 6.8. And I'm now going to explain, how we arrived at those numbers.
Can I interrupt you, Professor Kirzner? I see on the footnote there with the asterisks, we say these numbers are using the NCRRs from Mr. Hutchings' October report, but I think we've established that you were actually using the July
Those are from
numbers.
the July report,
Thank you. So we should make a
Yeah.
correction to slide 21 as well.
Yeah, that-
October should read July.
definitely from the July report.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you have anything else you wanted to tell us about slide 21? No, we're ready to move then. I see on the agenda then we're now moving into annual rates of return.
Right.
And that takes us, I think, to slide 24.
So, and I know, I'm sure that the other the plaintiff experts have also probably shown you this, Your Honor. To bring forward values or the present values, sorry, are entirely sensitive to annual rates of returns. So even a 1% difference in annual returns creates a factor of 5.374. Your Honor, these calculations are actually, they look complex, but they're actually fairly easy to do. I can take a hand calculator, which I have here, and I can enter 1.01, and I can bring it forward by pressing one button of 169, and that gives me the 5.374%. Okay, I mean the 5.374 multiplier, excuse me. The 3% difference yields a huge difference in the multiplier. So essentially 1.03 taken for 169 years compounded yields a multiplier of 147 difference.
So the word factor is also the multiplier? Is all,
Yes.
okay.
Can we move then to slide 25?
So, and this is just a restatement of something I said earlier, but I want to emphasize it. The experts arrived at very different forward values. I've shown the sensitivity to annual rates of returns of the multiplier. Just even a 1% difference yielding that different factor that we saw in the previous slide. Some experts use a single number such as the BTIR as it was each year. And our rates of returns are based on different historic spending and investment factors.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to get into a bit more of an explanation on multipliers, and I see that takes us to your slide 28. Can you help explain for us the multipliers?
So the multiplier is indeed the key measure in estimating the bring forward or present value numbers. And it's a distinguishing feature in comparing the different results that the experts obtained. Again, because the experts use different rates of returns, they ended up with different multipliers. As I said earlier, the starting dates and the amounts received and owed, that is to say the NCRRs, are common to the experts, subject to the modifications we talked about a little earlier. And so the differences are explained by the differences in the assumed rates of returns.
And that brings us to slide 29, where you get into a better explanation or more complete.
Okay, so I'm just gonna do a little bit of interest rate math here.
So
And I'm gonna start with a 1-year model. So I'm simply gonna assume that an amount of $1,200 is just a number. I just use it for illustration.
Okay.
Nothing particular. I assume that $1,200 was underpaid to someone in 2018. Now, let's assume that an appropriate rate of return on that amount was 4.66%. And I purposely used the 4.66 because that was an average in our model.
Model 4.
That's actually the model 4. Yes. So the multiplier is calculated by taking 1 plus the rate of interest, so it's 1.0466. And multiplying it by the $1,200 amount would give you the amount that should be paid. So if the underpaid amount was $1,200 and the multiplier is 1.0466, then the amount that should have been paid, in other words, the present value, is $1,255.92.
okay, I'm just gonna slow you right down here.
You haven't got to the last bullet point, which I think would be helpful.
Right.
You haven't got to the last bullet point on that page, which I think would be helpful.
Right.
Another way of expressing this $55.92 is
Okay, so
co-
as you can see, 1,200 grew to $1,255.92, which means $55.92 is the interest earned for the year or the return for that year.
Thank you. And I think that might be a little bit easier for non-finance experts to understand. So what you're showing us here is when you use that 4.66 rate of return, it means the next year you get paid $55.92 in interest. Is that right?
So in terms of
I didn't
the
hear the
matter at
answer.
hand, oh, sorry.
I said, is that right?
No, what you said is correct. And
Thank you.
again, just to relate it to the matter at hand, in this very simple 1-year model, 1255.92 would be the present value of the NCRR.
1255.92 is the present value.
1255.92.
Thank you.
So
In 2019.
in 2019, but only 1 year.
So in fact, is 1255.92 is the 2019 value of that amount.
the 2018 underpayment.
And when you, so you do this exercise for each year. And you don't complicate it by starting in 2019 at 1255, do you?
No, in fact, in the next slide, I go back to 2000, I do 2 years, and then I'm gonna show you 169 years.
Let's move to the next slide then, slide 30.
Yeah. So here's the same example, assuming $1,200 was underpaid, but now I'm gonna go forward 2 years.
Okay,
Again, using that 4.66% return.
okay, just let me get to it. So, okay,
So, Your Honor, the multiplier for that period would be to take the 1.0466 to the power of 2. That's a number of years. Again, on a hand calculator, you'd simply enter 1.0466, press the button that takes it to forward 2 years, and 1.0954 is the multiplier. In that case, going forward 2 years, the appropriate compensation for a $1,200 underpaid amount would be 1,200 times 1.0954, or $1,314.48. And let me add, Your Honor, that this is full compounding. So the $55.92 in interest we earned in the first period has been reinvested in the second period.
I am going to try to process this as we go, so I might be a bit slow with you. So and I know everybody else is quicker, but there we go. So when you do it for 2 years, you are compounding.
I am.
So the question I asked earlier, I was wrong. You do take, trying to learn or trying to remember how the power of 2 works, but you do take the year 1 amount. You take the you take the 1255.92 and you start with that in 2019.
For the next year, that's correct. Absolutely correct.
Okay.
And notice that includes the $55 in interest
Yes,
that we earned.
right.
And Your Honor, again, within the context of this matter, the multiplier is 1.0954 for year 1, and it's actually 1.0466 for year 2. I know that sounds confusing, because why for year 1? As I'll show you when we do the multipliers at the end of this exercise, you work your way through it that way. But
So you're showing us a mathematical calculation,
Right.
but the result of it is, as Justice Hennessy pointed out, that every year you're reinvesting the interest that would have been used the previous
absolutely.
year.
And I could be, maybe I'll be corrected by the plaintiff lawyers, but I'm sure that it's likely that the plaintiff experts would have done this the same way, just with different numbers.
I was going to suggest,
Can
your
I just
next,
finish the last one?
I was-
Because it's the third slide in this set.
yes, I was just going to say, I was going to
Okay.
suggest that we
Okay.
go on to the next slide because it's the last of the
This is
series.
the last of the
Yeah,
series. So,
and then,
okay.
then maybe we could take a break.
So now, Your Honor, I'm gonna go all the way back to 1850.
Okay.
I'm gonna use that same $1,200 amount. I'm going to assume that the appropriate rate of return was 4.657. Why did I change it? I've added a significant digit to actually reflect what happened over the period. It's the same exercise. That's all. Instead
So
of
5 digits.
Yeah, instead of 4.66, I use 4.657, okay?
All right.
And
Just to be more precise, is that right?
yeah.
Thank you.
Now you get this ugly looking formula of 1.04657 to the power of 169. But it's the same thing. The 169 is instead of the 1 or the 2, it means we're compounding for 169 years. And if you compound 1.04657 for 169 years, you get a multiplier of 2,192. And that translates into a large number.
And that is applied to the 1,200.
Exactly.
So that's 1 year of loss.
So it's 1,200 taken forward at 1 year of loss, taken forward at a 4.657% return for 169 years, gives you a multiplier of 2192.
Mhm.
And in order to the present value, to compensate somebody for underpaying them $1,200 169 years ago, the present value today is $2,630,400.
Where do I find, is that there?
It's the last line on that
Oh,
slide
oh, there it is.
31.
Thank you.
So just to make sure we're clear on that, Professor Kirzner, can you
Yes.
just repeat again then what those numbers on that last equation represent?
So we've got $1,200 underpaid to someone in 1850. Assuming that $1,200 was invested at 4.657% for 169 years. The multiplier is 2192, and that $1,200 would translate into $2,630,400.
We could continue going on if you think it's helpful, or would it be a good time for a break, Professor Kirzner? How are you
Let me
doing?
just see what the next slide is,
Sure.
okay?
Are we ready to move on, Justice Hennessy?
I actually would like a break if we could. I have
Oh.
another technical problem.
So why don't we break there and we'll come back to slide 32 after the break,
Thank you.
just to 15?
Yes, please. Okay, we'll take the break. I'll stay here. I need both.
This court will recess for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
You can sit down, the judge is.
Oh, okay.
Thank you all for that.
Kirzner, I think we were on we just finished slide 31, where you gave us the example of the multiplier. If you were to bring forward $1,200, 169 years. And that leads us then to slide 32.
Yes, so slide 32 really is the same concept. So Your Honor, what I've done here is I've contrasted the various expert rates, compound rates of returns, and showed how that results in different multipliers. And some of these numbers are going to be familiar. So I used 4% just as an anchor. And if I take 1.04, 4% for 169 years, I get a 756 multiplier. The 4.66% rate of return, the third line down, taken forward at 169 years, is that same number I calculated in the previous slide of 2192. A significant digits, 2191.80. It's the same number. And Hutchings-Stiglitz, using a 60-40 model at 7.2%, taken forward 1.072 for 169 years, gives you a multiplier of 126,741. Absolutely, I will. So the Hutchins-Stiglitz 60-40 model, taken forward at 7.2%, 1.072 for 169 years, gives you a multiplier of 126,741. I realize there's a lot of numbers, so.
Can I ask, Professor Kirzner, now this is if you were looking at 169-year period. And if you were looking at, so this is if you took money that should have been paid back in 1850, you would use these multipliers to find the present value of that money. Is that right?
That's right.
But if you were taking money that should have been paid in 1950, let's say 1950 instead of 1850, would this multiplier be the same?
No, they'd be different. So this one starts in 1850. If I use 4%, like in fact, I'll tell you, if we use 1950 instead of 1850,
69 years.
okay, so just to illustrate, to answer your question, if I took 4% for 169 years is 756, as shown in slide 32, the very first line.
Right.
If it's only 69 years, the multiplier is only 14.97.
Okay, so am I right then that for your calculation, the bring forward or present value calculation, you're using a different multiplier in every year to bring forward that
Would end
year's?
up with a different multiplier in every year, yes.
Thank you.
So the multiplier for 69 years is 14.97.
I'm just, Your Honor, I'm going to make sure I just calculate it. I want to make sure. Yes, 14.97.
So the only year that the multiplier is 126,741 is 1850. And 1851, there'll be a different one.
It would be a different one.
1900, there'll be a different one. 1910.
Your Honor,
No.
I can
No,
do
I
one
can't
more calculation for you if you'd like.
No, I believe I get the concept.
Okay,
All right, then are we ready to move then to slide 33?
so it's the rate of return assumptions. That's really what, and I realize that I'm repeating myself, but I just want to emphasize how important the rate of return assumptions are. And we believe they should not be level. And I think that in certainly some of the plaintiffs' approaches, they weren't level either, but they should reflect economic and market conditions at the time.
Can you
When you
tell
s-
me what level means? Oh, is that your question?
Yeah.
So for example, in the 1930s, during the Depression, rates of returns were very low. Market returns were low, returns on business were low. There was actually deflation during part of that period. So inflation adjusted returns would be very low. Similar in the 1970s, the period that people were worried about might be happening now. Not, in my opinion, but it's got nothing to do with this case, but 1970s was a stagflation period of slow economic growth with high inflation, which meant very low rates of returns. On the other hand, the 1990s, the great boom period as we came down from high inflation, disinflation, rates of returns were very high. So returns reflect a number of things of which economic and market conditions are extremely important.
And so the rates of returns that you use are just like those multipliers. They're different for every year of your calculations.
They're
Is that
different
right?
for every year of the calculation. Yes,
And so when you've provided for us in your report a rate of return for example, consumption, that's an average of these rates that vary every year?
very much so. And I'm going to illustrate how they varied in a few slides. Yes, yes.
And similarly, if I understand Professor or Mr. Hutchings' materials, would it be the case that he would have used different rates of return? He's always using the 60-40 equity bond split, but does that mean different rates of return each year?
Oh, they would be different every year. Sure. I mean, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchins' approach of a 60-40 bond, I forget it was 60-40 bond equity or equity bond, but their 60-40 approach would have reflected the market returns for bonds and equities each year. They'd be different every year.
Right. And so that figure that we talked of earlier of 7.2% is just an average.
It's a geometric, it's an average.
Right.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you corrected me again. I may not be using the right technical term in average, but
It's an average
I
is
think-
fine. Yeah.
okay, thanks. All right, are we ready to move to slide 34?
So where do we get a return of an average return of 4.66? So one could use the band trust account rates. You could use inflation rates to preserve purchasing power. You can use investment rates of returns. Now, you might use bonds, shares, other securities, such as the Stiglitz-Hutchings approach, or you might estimate returns on social investment, such as infrastructure, business, and social. Or you might use a combination of those rates, which is what we did.
All right. So I see the next slide is again, just bringing us back to the agenda, and we've now moved on to your Booth Kirzner bring forward model. And that takes us to slide 37. Can you explain for us now, slide 37?
So again, our multiplier is designed to, in our opinion, place the bands in the position they would have been in had they been paid the unpaid, given the unpaid amounts, but for the breach, the bring forward amount. And that means to us, among other things, investment in social investments that would benefit the bands today. And how we went about that is, I think.
The next slide, slide 38.
Right. Yes. So we wanted to ground our bring forward calculations in the historic reality of what actually happened to the bands. And we analyzed the historic spending patterns of the bands from the trust accounts to the extent we could, as a guide to how those additional payments might have been spent. So the next is to get into the actual trust accounts.
So that's slide 39.
Oh, sorry, just before we get there. So it is slide 39, sorry.
Did you have a question, Justice Hennessy?
Well, I have a question. I'm sure it's going to come on cross-examination. It must be the main point, but I just wouldn't mind you at least addressing it. In your report, you say, A, you had a hard time finding actual spending patterns.
We had
Well,
a
I'll
cha-
just leave that. You had a hard time, so, and so then you say, but we're still gonna use it. We'll
it
do our
was a
best.
ch- it was a challenge. We feel we met the challenge,
Okay,
but it's not a simple matter.
okay, but the second thing is, and I'm pretty sure it's been covered before, and I'm sure it will be covered again, but if you could just, when you're answering these questions, help address it, because otherwise I'm stuck on it, and that is how do you, your word, anchor the presumption that patterns of very poor people would reflect patterns of people or bands, patterns of bands who are struggling at a subsistence level would reflect patterns of, would reflect decision-making patterns of those who were had a much greater economic base.
And
Is that part of your thinking?
yes, that would show, well, that would show up in the trust accounts. So, for example, a very poor band, subsistence band, when you went through the trust accounts, you would find that a very high percentage of their spending was consumption.
Mhm.
They had to bury people. They had to go on relief. They had to buy a sack of corn to feed people. You find that the consumption items were very high.
Mhm.
I remember looking when we looked at there were 7 bands in the Alderville group, and
This
there
is
were
in a
some very
different
poor
place.
bands and there were some wealthier bands,
Mhm.
and they can't, and the numbers were very different.
Okay.
And when we looked at the trust accounts, we found very different results, Your Honor.
And so
Okay.
you just referred us to a work that you did for another case. You mentioned the Alderville bands.
Well,
Can you present?
we've looked at trust accounts for a number of other bands, and we found that exactly as I said, that for the poorer bands, a very high percentage would go to consumption. And for the wealthier bands, you'd find much higher levels of what we called social investment.
We might come back to that, but can we perhaps move then to slide 39?
So all of this is based on originally an economic interpretation of Whitefish Lake, that damages should be based on realistic contingencies, taking into account the actual spending patterns of the bands.
And
And
the Whitefish Lake decision you're referring to is that decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal in
that was the Ontario
2007?
Court of Appeal, 2007. And if the unpaid amount had actually been paid, money would have been deposited to the capital account. Interest earned would have been transferred to the revenue account. The money in the revenue account would be available for the band to spend. In our analysis, we focused strictly on the revenue account, because the revenue account informed how the actual spending patterns took place. The capital account was restricted. The revenue account was much richer in data, and we focused our attention strictly on the revenue account for our analysis.
So just to back up and explain the difference between the capital and revenue accounts, can you explain those different accounts for us?
Well, in the trust accounts, money that was owed to the band would be deposited to the capital account, subject to certain restrictions, and the interest earned in that capital account, which earned actually the band trust account rate, would then be transferred to the revenue account, which would be available for the band to spend.
So when you're looking at spending that took place from the revenue account, you're not looking at spending of all of the band's money, because some of that money is actually kept in the capital account. Is that right?
It's only what went into the revenue account that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you. Shall we move to slide 40?
So realistic contingencies, that's something that that was shown up, and I don't want to get into legal decisions because that's not really my area, but the word realistic contingencies is important. I think the next slide illustrates. So let's say $1 had been paid to the band in 1850. Or $1 should have been paid, I should say, to a band in 1850. What would they have done with it? Well, they might have spent it immediately, in which case there'd be nothing to invest. They could have invested it all and had the dollar to accumulate for 169 years at compound interest. Or, in our view, they would have consumed some of it and they would have invested some of it. And that is the breakdown between how $1 that should have been received in 1850 would have been allocated.
So on
We
the,
believe, and we believe that consuming some because they had to and investing some reflects realistic contingencies.
and so that graphic representation you have on slide 41 at the bottom there with A at one end and B at the other. Can you explain C
So-
for us?
In other words, we believe that it's somewhere in between. A means everything's spent and it's gone. B means that everything is invested to 2019 and accumulates at compound interest or whatever rate for 169 years. And C is that the result is somewhere in between. That some of it would have been consumed and some of it would have been invested.
So on this particular graph, it looks like you have the C not quite in the middle. Is this just a illustrative representation, or does this actually show what you believe the split would have been between say, spending and
I don't
investing?
think I was that precise in fixing where the C was, but not somewhere in between.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure we were clear on that. It's just a graphic
Yeah, no, it
representation.
wasn't.
It's. All right, can we move then to slide 42?
So we worked from the band trust account statements. Now, we only had the period 1880 to 1957 to work with. That's where we had the summaries of the band trust account statements. And so we had to work with what we had. And Your Honor, you referred to, I forget what words you used. I described it as a challenge in working. You used a different word. I forgot what it was, but I agree with it. It's not easy. Okay. We still feel that approach should be grounded in how the band's actually spent. But so we had the period 1880 to 1957 to work with. We employed Ernst & Young to do a sample because there was so much data. And we sampled from that period. We used 16 of the 34 bands. We used the bands with the most complete records. We used even years only. So we assumed that the odd year, the spending pattern of the even year, the spending pattern of the odd year was equal to the spending pattern of the even year. So if we had a spending pattern for 1860, we assume the same spending pattern existed in 1861. Ernst & Young did the classifications, but with guidance from us, and we classified the items in the trust accounts with respect to consumption, investment, what we call social investment, and transfers to individuals. Spreadsheet 1, which is very, very detailed, but everything's there in terms of how things were classified. I provide some examples. Those are examples only. It's actually spreadsheet 1, tab 1, that provides how every single item that was classified was actually classified. That's the base data.
Thank you. Can we go to slide 43 then?
So what did we do with the other periods? For the we had to extrapolate from the 1880 to 1957 sample.
1850?
Sorry, no, 1880.
Oh, right, sorry, I'm sorry,
1880 to 1957 sample.
right.
So for the 1850 to 1879 period leading up to the 1880, to where we started the analysis of the trust accounts, we assumed 50.33% spending and 59.67% retention.
Retention
Yeah.
meaning,
And that's retention is what was retained in the account earning the band trust account rate, not spent.
thanks.
We assumed for the spending, we used, and Professor Booth is going to describe this in greater detail, but we used aggregate savings numbers, and we assumed that 20% was invested and 80% was consumed. And we also use an upper number based on the upper, sort of the upper range of investment over the period of 35% investment, 65% consumption.
Can I stop you there? And
Yeah.
here you're talking about, when you talk about 20% and 80%, for example, you're talking about spending and consumption by individuals at this level. Is that right?
Actually, it's by both, as we're going to see.
And,
I'm-
I've missed a point somewhere here, if I can just go back to it. So you have a 50-49 split that you extrapolated, that you're applying to the 1850, 1879
That's right.
period. And then the question was retention, meaning, because it was 49.67 retention. And you said that was what was retained in the BTA,
in the trust account.
okay, in the trust account. And then for spending, somehow we jumped to savings numbers and invested numbers.
So we had to determine how the 50% was spent.
How the 50% were spent, and you're still assuming that,
Some would be invested and some would be consumed.
of the saving,
Of the-
sorry, of the consumption rate, you're still presuming 20% is invested. Okay,
That's right.
thank you.
Or 35% in the second
Or
example, models 3
35%
and
for the other
2
two
and
models.
4.
Okay. Thank you.
Investment earned a 7.1% annual real rate of return. I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Okay. Consumption earned the annual inflation rate.
And here you say at a minimum of 1%.
So, and this is important, there were many years, not so much in this period, but later on, as we'll see, there were years in which there was deflation, in which inflation was negative. If we used a negative number, it would mean that the rate of return awarded to the bands for their investment would have been very low, very, very low, unreasonably low. Now, it may have been reflective of the period, but we didn't think that was fair. So we capped inflation at a minimum of 1%.
And does this relate then to that correction that we made to your report? Because in 8 years you had,
So in models 3 and 4, there were 8 years in which I forgot to cap it at 1% and I used 0%.
but you've corrected for that. So
I've
now
corrected
everything
for
is
that.
at the minimum of 1%. Thank you.
And Your Honor, as I said, for the 49.67% retention, it earned the band trust account rate.
All right, can we go then to slide 44, where I see your talk
Yeah,
about
so-
the,
We've got another period.
right,
First, we have the
excuse me just for a minute, Mr. Kirzner, I see my friend has a. My friend is pointing out to me that, Justice Hennessy, you asked the question, on the consumption rate, you're still assuming 20% is invested.
Mhm.
And I think what you meant
Go ahead.
is on the spending side of the 50.33 spending. Some of that is still invested. My friend is
Spending,
concerned
okay,
about
thank you.
using the term consumption, but I think we'll clear that up because I think when we go
Sorry,
through it, Professor Kirzner will explain that consumption shows up a few times in the model. I think we'll get to that.
All right, so it's 20%. This was in 1850, I think, or that 20% of the spending was still invested.
That's right.
Yeah, if
Thank
I
you.
wasn't clear on that, I apologize. I meant it. If we just go back to the slide for 1 second.
Sure. Which slide is it then? The 43?
Yeah, I thought I said it, but if I hadn't, I was focusing strictly on the 50.33% spending.
Yes,
The
that's right.
49.67% retention earns a BTR.
Thank you. In fact, when Justice Hennessy posed her question, Justice Hennessy, you asked of the 50.33% consumption, some is still invested. I didn't correct that term consumption because I thought what you meant was spending. But my friend has pointed out that consumption is actually used elsewhere.
It'll show up again.
Yeah,
yes.
so we'll get to that. I'm sure we will. Can we get to slide back where we were, slide 44?
Yes, so we have another period to deal with. Since we didn't have trust account data, we again had to extrapolate. And what we did, and things were fairly consistent by this point, we assumed that the actual spending patterns for the next period of 58 to 2019 were identical to those of 1956, 57. 1956 is similar to the 1880, 1956 numbers. We felt they were representative, and we thought it was a realistic assumption that the spending patterns would be the same as 56, 57. Again, it would be nice to have had the data, but we didn't have it.
So the next period is 1956. I'm missing it partly because I'm looking at the transcript and I'm missing it. So the next period you're talking about is now,
Right.
is what?
And Your Honor, I'm going to clarify. So there's 3 periods. There's the period 1880 to 1957, for which we have data. And so that's what we worked with.
Right.
There's also the period, this case starts in 1850. There's also the period 1850 to 1879, where we use that split that I explained previous slide. And then there's one third period, the period after 1957, 1958 to the present to 2019, where we use the spending patterns of 56, 57.
I'd just like to go back to those 3 periods, Professor Kirzner. So it's your understanding there was no data from those early years from 1850 to 1886? And what about the period from 1958 to 2019? Are there not banned trust account data available for that time period?
Various reports, but there wasn't the trust account summaries that that we were able to obtain. They just didn't exist.
Or
1958 to 2019.
so it's so that period is 58, not 57, or? Okay. Got it.
All right, so I think that means we can move on to slide 46. Slide 45 is just introducing where we are in your presentation. I think we're at slide 46.
Right, so again, I've talked about this just in a slightly different format. So what did we observe for the revenue count? We saw that 1% each year was saved, or retained, and that 1% was spent. And what was it spent on? Some of it was consumed. Some of it was spent on social investments, business, human capital, infrastructure. And some of it was transferred to individuals. And those individuals vested some and saved some.
And presumably some of those payments, transfers to individuals were also consumed.
Right.
So that takes us to slide 47, which I think we've seen before.
So this is, yes, but I think it's helpful to look at it again, even though we looked at it earlier. So what would the bands have done if they had received the unpaid amount? So on the left-hand side, some of it would have been spent. Some of it would have been consumed, which earns a rate of inflation. Some of it would have been invested in social investments for the benefit of the band, in infrastructure and business, in human capital. Some of it would have been transferred to individuals, and there's where we once again see that 20, 80, 35, 65 split of how the individuals would have spent the money. And then, Your Honor, on the right-hand side, we have the fact that some of it would have stayed in the band's trust account and would have earned the band trust account rate.
Can we move then to slide 48?
So the spending assumes proportionality. And Your Honor, I think you were getting at this when you asked me about poor bands and wealthier bands. We are assuming that the bands would have spent the additional funds in the same way that actually occurred. That's I'm going to give a caveat to that later on, but that is the proportionality assumption. We've always felt that that's the appropriate guide to use to inform how the bands, in fact, how the bands spent would have been a guide to how they would have spent.
What does always mean? We've always thought.
Oh, in our previous analysis, sorry, yeah, trust accounts. We've assumed that some is consumption based, which earned the inflation rate. And then some is social investment, which adds to the band's social capital.
Can we then
And
move?
sorry, and you say that's a by proportion.
By proportion, that's right.
Are we ready then for slide 49?
So we now knew what the band invested in, what they consumed in, and we are now ready to move forward with that.
So you've mentioned here that consumption and investment categories. Are you going to take us through then those categories of how you categorize the spending in the revenue account?
Right, I've done it through examples, really.
Shall we
And these
move
are
to
these are
slide
just-
50 then? Do we start that on slide 50 then, these examples?
So these are examples of items. Now, again, there's many other items that show up, and if you want to go deep into the consumption and the social investment issues, you'd be looking in detail at spreadsheet 1. Spreadsheet 1 has the complete breakdown of how items were classified, but some examples of consumption were items such as funerals, clothing, tobacco, funerals, fuel and oil, furniture, costs, relief, loans to members. The trust accounts, often you only see a single word. You have to interpret what it means. And we worked with Ernst & Young on that. So those would be examples of consumption items. Then examples of,
Shall we move on to slide 51 then?
right, so examples of infrastructure would be items such as housing, lumber, roads and sidewalks, bridges, labor, roads, sidewalk grading would be examples of infrastructure.
I'm gonna stop you there. I see we've got two road sidewalks and gradings twice here, but can you tell me about, I noticed in your spreadsheet one, a lot of lime. What is lime? Like, why did you categorize that as infrastructure? I understand.
Lime is something that's used in construction.
Thank you.
That's all I can say.
Thank you. That's all I
I
wanted.
can give a more
Has
scientific.
something to do with concrete.
There's a lot of lime. I thought it had something to do with the roads, to be honest.
Business, this band did not spend,
When you say this band,
sorry, yes, sorry,
when you say this band, you mean these bands? Because you looked at
these
16 of
bands,
them.
I'm sorry, these bands did not spend a lot on business, but business included, as you'd expect, hunting and fishing, farming and agriculture, and there's some of the examples of items that went into farming and agriculture, and forestry.
I also wanted to get back to the issue of which bands we're talking about, because I understand when you did your analysis, you looked not just at Robinson Superior bands, but also Robinson Huron bands.
That's correct. It was RHT and RST, and it was the sample from the 34 bands.
So the 34 is the combo of RST and RHT.
Yes,
Which means I take it then that your breakdown of categories is really just representative. It's not necessarily specific to these Robinson Superior bands.
no, it was represented. We needed a significant size sample. And the 16 bands represented a significant sample, but it was from the two groupings, yes.
Thank you.
And am I correct that when you said that first, you said, and we chose those with the best records?
We
Or,
chose those with the most complete records, Your Honor, yes.
so not necessarily random? I'm not, there's no value in that.
So I think we can move then to slide 52. No, yes, 52.
Oh, so these are just again, examples of human capital, which included medical, education. Under education, you'd see items such as supplies and books and equipment and training. Band property, which included, fuel and wood and council halls and utilities and supplies. And then, payments to individuals. The other category.
Now, on slide 53, I see you go through some percentages, and I think here's where I wanted to introduce a new demonstrative aid, which is a new version of figure 1 from your original report. So we've already provided a copy of this to my friends and the court. It's figure 1 with some colored numbers, and I'd like to bring you a copy, Professor Kirzner, and we can use this as we talk about your slide.
Great. Thank you.
And I'd like to mark it as an exhibit, but maybe we should do that at the end of the questioning.
I have no objection to the marked as an exhibit.
Thank you. Why don't we do that then?
So I'll go to figure 1 on this.
It's this new piece of paper, Justice Hennessy. It's not in the well, if you want to compare it with what's in the report, in the main report, which is marked as exhibit 38,
Yes,
you'll see figure 1 at page 38, interestingly enough, exhibit 38, page 38. And you might recognize this, Justice Hennessy, because I did refer to it in
Yes,
my opening statement. But we now have a new exhibit, which is a more, the same figure one with some numbers added in that I'm going to ask Professor Kirzner to explain. And this new exhibit should be numbered, I think we're now at 41,
42.
42. So this will be exhibit 42 then. This one sheet called Booth Kirzner Report, Figure 1 with average percentage allocations and rates of return.
sorry, what, did you call it?
Booth Kirzner Report, Figure 1
Yes,
with average percentage allocations and rates of return.
and is it possible to call it a revised figure one from the original report? Or as an annotation?
Sure,
Yeah.
we could call it Booth Kirzner Report, Figure 1 revised.
If you don't mind, I would not consider it a revision
Oh,
of the,
That's a good point. Thank you.
I would consider it an augmentation.
Thank
And,
you.
and Ms. Evans, if you don't mind, I'm gonna make a suggestion, okay?
Sure.
I think if we did slide 53 first and then went to the augmentation, I think that might be clearer.
That would be a good idea. Thank you, Professor Kirzner. That's what we'll do.
Your Honor, okay?
Just to get everybody, get the paperwork sorted out, though, I want to make sure, I think you made a very good point. It's not actually a revision. It's just a further, it's sort of a, none of these numbers are new. They come from your report. They're just inserted onto the chart. Is that?
They're all in here, so if
They're
I.
in
if I
here
went-
being in the
if I
slide and
went
in the
through
report.
slide
Yeah.
First, I
Sorry,
think it
can I
would
just
make
ask
the
a
augmentation clearer, I would hope. Okay,
Can you just wait for a minute, Professor Kirzner? I just want to clarify with Justice Hennessy, did we get an appropriate title for this exhibit?
for me, I called it Booth Kirzner Figure 1 augmentation. If you agree with that.
I called it that too.
Okay, that's what we'll call it then, if you think my title is too long. Augmentation, we'll call it. All right, but before we get to that new exhibit 42, let's look at your slide 53, where you're going to start explaining some of this.
So over the time period, over the sample period, and you've seen these numbers before, the average percentage spending was 50.33 and the average percentage retained was 49.67. Those are averages. But how is it broken down? Payments to individuals averaged 20.11%. They were much higher in the earlier years. They were as high as 66%. And then the payments to individuals fell steadily. Consumption averaged 15.23%. It was lower in the 1880 to 1926 period, but not surprisingly, it rose during the Depression. It was as high as 31%. Human capital, 9.3%. Spending on education, medicine, banned property. It was higher than this until 1910 and then fell fairly steadily. And then we've got the 49.67% retained, which earned the BTAR every year, but there was considerable variation and it rose fairly steadily over the years. So those numbers are in the augmentation slide.
And before we go to that augmentation exhibit, the exhibit 42, I'd like to actually move on to your slide 54. And
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
yeah, so can
Yes.
we look at your slide 54, which I think sort of summarizes the points you made in 53.
So all I did in 53, those were the key spending areas, but just for completeness, I showed where the remaining spending went and went to infrastructure, business and miscellaneous, and there's where you get the 50.33%.
Okay, and then again, before we go to figure one, the new exhibit 42, I'd like to just turn to your report so we can see exactly where in your report you present these numbers. And I see it's starting at paragraph 102. So if we look at exhibit 38, which is your original report, and turn to page 41. We're looking at exhibit 48, the original report. And we're turning to page 41. I'd like to start at paragraph 102, and I see here, this is where you have the figures 50.33% saved and 49.67% retained.
Right.
And then can you take us through your paragraph 103 and show us how that matches up with your slide 54?
Right, those are the same numbers.
They're the
Yes.
same numbers. Thank you. All right, and
Sorry, so paragraph 103 matches the numbers in slide.
54,
Thank you.
53 and 54. We're showing here where in the report Professor Kirzner explains the 20.11% payment to individuals and the 15.23% consumption, the 9.3% human capital, et cetera. I just thought it would be helpful to ground this in the report.
Thank you.
And I'm not quite done because we need to turn the page to paragraph 107.
Go ahead.
Paragraph 107, where we see 3.2% for infrastructure. Now I notice on your slide 54, you've got 3.16%. Is that intended to be the same as 3.2%?
That's just 3.2 is just rounding,
Thank you.
same number.
And so the last one then is business. In your report at paragraph 107, you say the average business spending was 2.3%. And am I right? That matches up with your slide 54,
2.28, same number. Yes.
2.28%. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now I think we're ready then to take a look at that exhibit 42, the figure one augmentation. And I see that this figure has new colors. There's percentage allocations in purple and rates of return in green. And right now we're just talking about the percentage allocations. Is that right?
Right, so the purple numbers are the ones we just talked about, and we've seen a number of times. And then this augmentation slide shows the average rate that each of those categories earned over the time period.
Okay, so just keeping with the purple figures, the percentage allocations, then can you explain for me one more time where these purple figures come from?
Well, over the sample period, consumption averaged 15.23%. Social investment averaged 3.16, human capital averaged 9.3, transfers to individuals averaged 20.11.
Right, and these figures then match up with your slide 54, is that right?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
I'm just catching up. Purple numbers are percentage allocations of if I were making a legend on this sheet, the purple numbers are,
The purple numbers are the same as the numbers in slide 54.
right?
They are the actual average percentage spending in those categories.
And we talked before about, you looked at these for the time period you had data for from 1880 to 1957. In each year, you didn't use these averages, you used the
Well,
actual
of course
data.
not. I used the actual for the year, and these are the averages for illustration.
Thank you. And you just told us on one of your earlier slides that consumption, for example, in some years would have been only 10%. But this figure of 15.23 is an average.
Right, you know, it was as high as 30 some odd percent during the Depression, for example.
So really, this is just for illustrative purposes then, this chart, because the averages,
Well, it's illustrative, yes, but I think it's provides some insight into how these bands behaved over the time period.
and in fact, for the period from no, that's right, okay. Let's strike that question. All right, so could we then go to, well, we'll keep this Exhibit 42 on hand because I think we'll get back to it when we talk about rates of return. But why don't we go then to your slide 55?
Right, so this is the I talked about this before. This is the assumed spending and retention for the time period. And that's for the bring forward period of 1850 to 1879. I explained how I used 50.33 and 49.67. And how spending by individuals ranged between 20 and 35% on investment over the time period. So this is just a repeat of previous one. Similarly, for the post period, I assumed that the spending was identical to the 1956-57 years.
And I noticed
Just
that,
the title of the document?
yes,
Go ahead.
I
Oh,
noticed
yeah,
that
yeah, I see, yeah.
in the title of the document, we have just a typographical error
Yeah.
where you say spending pattern assumptions 1850 to, what number should that be? What year?
1850 to 1879.
It should be 79,
Yeah,
so we just
I
need to
think
correct that error.
Yeah.
Now, I understand you're going to get into a further discussion to explain these. You have 4 different models, and I think
Right.
that takes us to the next slide. Can you explain the 4 different models that you've come up with?
So Your Honor, we used 4 models. Model 1 was our base model in which we assumed for those transfers to individuals, which were, you know, fairly important, that 20%, 80% split that we've talked about. We capped inflation at 5% on the upside. There were some years in which inflation was very, very high and it gave very high rates of returns on investment. So we capped it and we used the 1% minimum downside. For model 2, we assumed a 35-65 split, but we still capped inflation at 5 and 1% on the downside. For models 3 and 4, however, which were in both respects identical to 1 and 2, except we did not cap inflation. So if inflation was 9%, as it was in 1973, that's the number that was used. And for model 4, again, we have the 35-65 split, but inflation is not capped. In all cases, inflation never goes below 1%.
And what would be the justification for capping inflation at 5%?
Well, when I first looked at the data, you get some there were some years in which inflation was very high, as I said. Okay, during the 1970s, for example, there was also an inflationary period in the 1950s, and when you take a high inflation rate and a reasonable return on social investment, you end up with a very high nominal rate. and you actually get a. I don't want to go too deep into this because I don't want to confuse things, but you can get a paradoxical result. In the 1970s, if you use the actual rate of inflation, you end up with very high rates of return on investment, even though the 1970s were a poor period for investment. But nevertheless, in models 3 and 4, we ignore that paradox, and we simply allow inflation to go as high as it did.
Okay, thank you. Now, before we move on, I wanted to go back again to your report. Because we saw another version of this figure 1 in your report. So again, we're looking at exhibit 38, your original report, and I want to turn to page 40.
40, sorry.
Page 40. We'll just wait for Justice Hennessy to get there. Now, on page 40, we have what's called figure 2, which looks similar to figure 1, except here you used a specific year, 1880,
Right, just to illustrate.
as an illustration. I see the figures for 1880 are on page 39 of your report.
Right.
And this just shows as an example that in that particular year, 1880, the percentage allocations were different than the average.
Yes, very different.
And yet, again, the figure 1 augmentation is showing not just a specific year, but the average then.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I just thought it would be helpful to explain that figure 2, why it's in the report with different numbers on it. And you explain that in your report. At
So-
paragraph.
Would it be correct just simply to say that when we look at page 40, not 1880, it's an actual year with actual
That
data.
is the actual year.
And that's why it doesn't match the data in exhibit 42.
No,
The-
it wouldn't match at all. The
Okay.
data in 42 are averages over the entire time period. And 1880 is an illustration of one year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. All right, so I think we're then ready, if we're still all right for time, in terms of whether the court or reporter, if anybody needs a break, otherwise we'll move on.
You could.
We move on for
Thank you.
a little bit longer till the break. Because I think now we're ready to turn to a slightly different topic, which is the annual rates of return. Then you've already explained for us the spending and investment categories. And now we're on your slide 58.
Right, so it's not, it's a continuation topic, because it shows how we use what we've just talked about into translating those into annual rates of returns for each year.
So then we're on to slide 59.
So we start with real rates of returns for each category. Real rate of return before inflation. And we'll just call that 1 plus R. Adjust for inflation, that's 1 plus the inflation rate. We also adjust for depreciation because assets wear out. And that's 1 minus the depreciation rate. I'll give illustrations of this, so it'll make it a lot clearer in a moment.
All right, can we move then to slide 60?
So rates of returns we used, and Professor Booth is going to talk to this when he testifies. The real rates of returns were 5.5 for infrastructure, 8.2 for business, and 7.5 for human. Now, in terms of materiality, I mean, everything matters, of course, but in terms of materiality, the human number 7.5 is probably the most important because it shows up as one of the larger spending categories. And infrastructure at 5 point, business is 8.2, but there wasn't a lot of spending on business by these bands.
Could we then go back to Exhibit 42, Figure 1 augmentation? And see where you plug in these numbers from your slide 60?
Oh, so you can see it in the column under social investment based infrastructure. They're all there in green.
In green. All right, so the purple figures are the average percentage allocations and the green figures are the rates of return.
And since we're on that, I might as well point out that since we've identified the infrastructure, business and human capital rates, the average rate for inflation over this entire time period was 3.57%.
Okay,
And I want to stop you there. Well, actually, let's get back to inflation. You can finish
Okay.
going on. And we'll get back to inflation. Sorry, Professor Kirzner, you were going to explain, now looking at that Exhibit 42, the Figure 1 augmentation, you've explained the average inflation rate of 3.57%. You've explained the real rates of return used for infrastructure, business, human capital. Can you then explain what rate was used for the payments to individuals,
Yes,
which
we
was saved or
assume that,
invested?
we just took the average of infrastructure, business and human capital and 7.1. It's fairly, we think it's, it's a bit of a generous number because it uses the business number equally weighted, which was actually a small spending number, but that's what we use, 7.1.
All right. And are these rates of return, for example, the 5.5% infrastructure, did you use that same rate throughout all of the years of your analysis? Or did the rates
Oh,
change?
no, each year is different. Each year is whatever, we're gonna look at that in a moment, but those are the averages.
These are the averages then. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, no. Yeah. For infrastructure, for business and human capital, those are the real rates that we used. Yes,
Okay.
I'm sorry, not for inflation, but those are the real rates that we used,
Thank
sorry.
you.
not
Yeah.
adjusted for inflation.
not adjusted for inflation.
There's just one other green rate of return we haven't talked about on this Exhibit 42, and that's the 5.3% earning. That's the band trust account rate, the average band trust account rate over the
That's
period.
the average I calculated for the band trust account rate over the time period.
And
Sorry, where are you?
I'm on Exhibit 42, Figure 1
Yes,
augmentation. If you look at the far right column, the amount of money that would have stayed in the band trust account,
yes.
the rate of return for that,
Mhm.
almost half of the money, 49%, the rate of return for that is 5.3%. And that is the average band trust account rate.
Right.
So that wasn't calculated. You used the rate?
I used the band trust account rate each year. Whatever it was, I used it. And it averaged 5.3 over the time period. Some years it was 5, some years it was 6.
And the
I
band
s-
trust account rate is a rate that the other experts used as well because it's available in the
We
public
should have
record.
all used the same, we should have all used the same band trust
Excuse
account
me,
rate.
Professor Kirzner, we have to be very careful not to talk over one another, so the reporter can't catch it. So I'm going to start my question again, and then you can answer. And my question was that band trust account rate is the rate that all of the experts used, and they would have gotten it from a public source.
We should have all used the same band trust account rate. All of the experts should have used the same one.
So the band trust account rate isn't something that you estimated, it's something that exists in the documentary record.
No, I did not estimate it. I used it from the data I had, yes.
Thank you. So when we're looking at these rates of return in green on this Exhibit 42, Figure 1 augmentation, you've told us that throughout the time period, you used the real rates of return for infrastructure, business, and human capital, and the rate of return for money saved or invested by individuals at 7.1%, those figures you use throughout the time period. Is that right?
For the real rate, yes.
Okay, thank you for that clarification for the real rate. Now, the other figures, the other rates of return on the augmentation, the figure 1 augmentation, exhibit 42, are the average rate of inflation and the band trust account rate. And you just told us that for the band trust account rate, that 5.3 is actually an average. Is that right?
Yes,
Now, what about the inflation rate? Where do you get the 3.57%?
that's also an average of the inflation rate data we used.
Okay, now,
It's- it's-
noticed-
It's in, sorry. It's in spreadsheet 7.
all right, I noticed that all of these numbers on our exhibit 42, the augmentation, appear in your report except for the 3.57%. And that's just because you didn't average it in your written report?
I didn't, I didn't need it for the report,
But we can,
calculated it, but
but it can be calculated. You've just said spreadsheet 7. This chart actually is written spreadsheet 4, so I think maybe that's is it 7 or 4? Or maybe we should look at it
I don't
again over the
recall
break.
offhand, I'd have to-
Okay, we'll look at that over the break to ensure whether it was 7 or 4, or maybe it's in both. All right, so I think that left us at, we just went through slide 60. So I think we're now ready for slide 61.
Yes, so I've talked about the 20/80, 35/65 split a number of times now.
Mhm.
The portion spent earned the inflation rate for the year. So that's the consumption earned 1 plus the inflation rate. And the portion invested earned a real rate of 7.1. And to translate that real rate of 7.1 into a nominal return, you take 1.071 times 1 plus the inflation rate for the year. The inflation rate for the year would be different every year.
Okay, thank you. So I understand now when you said before that although the real rate is constant for those social investment categories, the actual nominal rate that you return, that you use each year, since it's once you take account of inflation, it changes.
The
Is that right?
inflation rate's very important because the actual rate of return each year is going to reflect these constant real rates, but also the inflation rate that is peculiar to that particular year.
I wonder if, would it be, does it make sense then to go on to depreciation, maybe before we then take a
I
break?
think it flows directly from this.
Okay, let's go to the next slide then, 62 on depreciation.
So we also introduced a depreciation factor. So there are 3 elements. There are 3 elements that determine the rate of return for the year. One is the real rate. The second is the inflation rate. And the third is the depreciation factor. Those 3 combine to create the rate of return for the year. Professor Booth is going to testify on why there's a depreciation factor. And he's also going to testify on how we came up with these numbers, but in our view, real assets depreciate, they wear out, education has to be renewed, highways have to be repaired. So real assets, these are not investment assets, these are real assets, they depreciate. And again, Professor Booth will elaborate on this. So what depreciation factor did we use? Well, these are again based on very supportable data that Professor Booth has for infrastructure. we assume that there's a 30-year life. So a road, 30-year life. And that translates into a 3.3% depreciation factor each year. 1/30 is 3.3. Business has a 20-year expected life. 1/20 is 5% per year. Human capital, 25-year life. 1/25 is 4% per year. And individual payments, an average of those, 24.4-year life, which translates to 4.1% per year.
Thank you. I think it would make sense to
Now
go
we
through
put
the
it
next
together.
2 slides.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as I said, Your Honor, there's 3 elements to the rate of return each year. Real, inflation, and depreciation. Here's an example. It's just an example. It's and I use 3.5% and I use infrastructure. So we know that the real rate for infrastructure is 5.5, 1.055. With a 3.5% inflation rate, you'd have 1.055 times 1.035. And then since infrastructure depreciates at a rate of 3.3% a year, that's where you get the 0.967 number. 0.967 is 1 minus 0.033. Multiply the 3 together and you get 5.589%. That's our number for that year for infrastructure. Another example is a payment to an individual where the real rate is 7.1. I'm illustrating with a 3.5% inflation rate. Payment adjust for depreciation, and you get 7.041%. So each year you have to multiply all 3 numbers together to get the rate of return for that particular category.
Thank you. Can we move then to slide 64, which I think will be the last one before the break?
So this is to summarize what I've just said. So each year we know that money was either saved in the trust account or spent. The money saved in the trust account earned the band trust account rate. Percent spend, business, there's that 1.02 times 1 plus the inflation rate times the depreciation factor. The same for each category. The real rate times 1 plus the inflation rate times 1 minus the depreciation rate. For business, human capital, infrastructure, payments to individuals that were invested, payments to individuals that were spent. And Your Honor, notice that for the payments to individuals that were spent, it's only 2 factors. 1 factor, it's the 1 plus the inflation rate.
I suggest that it would be a good time to break for lunch. But I have one last thing I wanted to mention to the court and my friends. I feel it might be a good time to correct this. In my opening statement, I used a version of figure 1. I had one of my numbers wrong, and I thought it might be worthwhile explaining that because I don't want people to get confused.
You used a version of,
I used a version of this figure 1 in my opening statement.
yes,
And I inserted,
which is now exhibit 42 or just,
it's a slightly different version now. Like
right, but you used the figure 1.
I used figure 1
Got it.
and I added in the rates of return in my opening statement.
Mhm.
But where I made the mistake was instead of the average rate of inflation, which Professor Kirzner has now told us is 3.57%, I mistakenly, when I read the report, I mistakenly used the inflation rate for that 1880 example. And so I told the court it was 2.97% or 79%.
0.97.
I said it was 2.97, and that was my mistake because that is the rate, according to the report, that is the rate in 1880. But Professor Kirzner has now told us that the average rate over the time period is actually 3.57%. And I just felt I should make that correction if people are going back to the old figure that I used in the opening statement and wonder why there's that change.
Thank you.
I don't think that my aid during opening was marked as an exhibit, but I know you probably have a copy of it, and I thought I should correct that.
Thank you very much.
And I think then we're ready to break.
Take the break.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Just for the record, I believe your opening statement was exhibit C.2.
Did I include those chart with that? And did it include the on chart? Or did I? You wrote them in one. So it's not actually an exhibit, it was.
So your opening statement was exhibit C, but this table wasn't.
That's
part of it.
correct. It wasn't part of it, but when I was giving my statement orally, I know people were jotting figures down as I was making them, mentioning them. And I think I probably included it in the body of my opening statement, but in any event, I'll have the chance in closing to correct it. I just thought I would make the correction now so people can follow along.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take the break then. 2:30.
Thank you. 2:30.
Thank you.
This court will recess until 2:30. Thank you.
Council, can I just ask